Number 10 on the top 10 list of things that cause workplace injuries is exposure to hazardous chemicals, substances, or environments. And this one's always a little bit surprising to me, because as a trainer, this is probably the one topic that I spend the most time on, and it's probably the least recognized hazard that affects pretty much everybody that works in almost every field. And yes, that means the offices too. Now, while I could spend the next 2.5 minutes talking about HazCom and hazardous materials and the OSHA definition of hazardous materials and substances, that's not necessarily what this statistic represents.
It's in there.
But it also represents things like working in extreme temperatures, both high and low, working in especially dusty environments, even if the dust is not itself a hazardous substance. An environment doesn't necessarily have to be filled with asbestos to do harm to your health and wellness. But those kinds of hazards are generally the things that are focused on when you're in a training session that talks about hazardous environments and hazardous substances. So for this topic, I'm going to refrain from recounting horror stories or otherwise using examples from the past, even though that's what this series is really about. For this topic, I'd like to talk a little bit more about how to take training and where training sessions focusing on this topic should be coming from, and how the lessons learned can translate into everyday life. Now, while some safety training is very specific about procedures and best practices and things like that, those nuts and bolts training sessions are usually reserved for those that have direct involvement in whatever hazard they're trying to prevent. And they are exceptionally important. But when it comes to something as amorphous as a dangerous environment or a dangerous substance or material or chemical, sometimes that relevance can be lost a bit in the translation. For instance, I've conducted hundreds of safety orientation sessions with new employees, contractors, visitors, vendors, and every single one of them talked about the environment. In fact, the vast majority of what I would go over had directly to do with the environment as opposed to any specific safety topic. And it really didn't have anything to do with top 10 injury modalities or top 10 OSHA violation citations or anything like that. What it was about was awareness. I think one thing with regards to safety that gets relied upon an awful lot by employers is common sense. And with respect to this topic, oh well, they should have told me they were too hot, or they should have told me that this chemical irritated their lungs. And in a lot of ways, it's that attitude that ends up causing the types of injuries that end up in this category. And it's oftentimes a very personal response, because there's a lot of factors that can go into how a person humanly responds to an environment, to a substance, to a hazardous or even non-hazardous chemical. That the most effective way to combat these injuries is to be aware and to teach and preach awareness about dangers in the environment.